Hello, welcome to FTA Virtual Procurement and Orientation. This recording will provide an overview of FTA procurement requirements. Important concepts will be briefly addressed. If you are in need of more in-depth coverage of any topic, you are encouraged to view all or any of the FTA Virtual Procurement Training modules. Module 1 covers pre-award concepts, covers steps and concepts that must be taken into consideration prior to issuance of a solicitation, such as written standards of conduct, ensuring most economical purchase, pre-qualification, independent cost estimates, etc. Module 2 covers contract methodologies, the various contract methodologies that FTA encourages to promote competition, such as small purchase, sealed bid, and requests for proposals, as well as other methods such as architect and engineering procurements, sole source, piggybacking, and state purchasing schedules. Module 3 covers post-award concepts. It discusses the steps taken in the procurement process once bids and proposals have been received and includes cost and price analysis, debarment and suspension, and responsibility determinations. Module 4 is dedicated to Buy America, both rolling stock as well as steel and iron and manufactured products. For information on how to gain access to these modules, contact your local regional contract administrator.
All right, we'd like to begin, of course, with discussing current regulations and guidance. In December of 2014, the rule that we had been operating under for many years was superseded with a new rule called the Uniform Administrative Requirements, or the Super Circular, at 2 CFR Part 200. Now, this is a very large regulation. It deals with all aspects of grants, including finances, etc. But the procurement sections we have noted for you on the chart are 317 to 326. Be sure you are familiar with these, that you've bookmarked them, even printed them out and read them. We're also today going to mention to you the FAST Act, the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act of 2015. It affected procurement, especially in the area of Buy America, the procurement of rolling stock, the domestic content requirements there. And it introduced a new policy with regard to using state procurement contracts. We'll mention that. And finally, the FTA Master Agreement is the contract between your agency and FTA. You should be familiar with that. There is a procurement section, and the Master Agreement is published every year on the FTA website, usually in October. So make sure you have read that and you're familiar with it. The other important document is the FTA Procurement Circular 4221F. Now, you'll notice the note there, the last revision was in 2013. That was before the Super Circular was issued. And so it's somewhat out of date, and you may find contradictions. And our second note tells you that in the event of contradictions, the federal regulation, which is the law, takes precedence over the FTA circular, the circular being guidance, not law. And so be aware of that. As to applicability of the circular and the regulations, the general rule is that where FTA funds are used in a procurement, that contract is going to be subject to the federal rules. Now, we would, just as an aside, mention revenue contracts because there's no spending of federal money. The money is coming from industry to you. And so I just want you to be aware that FTA does have a policy that these contracts be competed at reasonable intervals. There's no contract clauses required. Okay, so let's move on then. If you're getting operating assistance funding from FTA, the rule is that if you can segregate these funds and show they're being used only on certain contracts, then just those contracts need comply with the regulations. Operating contracts funded entirely with local funds are not subject to the circular or the regulation. Now, the third bullet is important because it's discussing the rule for capital projects. And that rule is different than operations. When FTA funds a capital project, as that project is defined in the grant, all project contracts are subject to the circular, even those funded only with local funds. So this is different than operations. I want to tell you about a real story, a real event that happened. In 2010, the city of Houston had a major rail car procurement, selected a European contractor. Well, of course, it was subject to Buy America, which means that all vehicles, the final assembly of all vehicles has to take place in the United States. But the Europeans wanted to work on the prototype in Europe where their engineers were. So the city of Houston thought that they could avoid the Buy America for the prototype by issuing a separate contract with local funds only for the prototype. That precipitated a protest. FTA Legal got involved and basically told Houston to cancel the procurement and start again because of this rule that all project contracts on capital projects have to comply with the rules. So keep that in mind if you ever get money for a capital project from FTA. What about preventive maintenance? If you're applying the FTA funds as a bottom line funding to make up for the deficit, then all of your preventive maintenance contracts would have to comply with the rules. But if you can segregate the money again, as with operations, to just specific contracts, then just the specific contracts would have to comply with the circular. Moving on to the issue of buying real estate, which would be land and any existing buildings or structures on that land are not covered by FTA Circular 4220. They are covered by other circulars. Contact your regional office for guidance as to what the rules are when buying real estate. And finally, we're asked sometimes, what about third-party contractors? These are the ones that you award through your procurement process. Do they have to comply with 4220? And the answer is no. 4220 is applicable to recipients and to sub-recipients, and third-party contractors are neither. So their responsibility is to comply with the clauses that you put in their contracts. Do not incorporate 4221F by reference, which we have sometimes seen. It was never intended to apply to them. So moving on to the FAST Act again. Prior to this statute, FTA had a policy that recipients could only use the state procurement contracts of their own state. But FAST Act has changed that. Now you are allowed, as far as the feds are concerned, to use the contract of any state, as long as that state allows you to come in. And keep in mind, we're talking about contracts awarded by the state. These are not talking about cooperative purchasing ventures, which is always are coming up. But these are state contracts awarded for subordinate agencies within the state. You are now allowed to use the contract of any state. FAST also required FDA to establish a joint procurement clearinghouse where recipients could come together and find partners to do joint procurements of rolling stock. But this tool has not been used, and it is always there. If you have an interest, talk to your regional office. Importantly, most importantly, FAST increased the domestic content requirement of components for rolling stock from 60% to 70% over several fiscal years. Fiscal 2020, we are in the realm of the 70% rule, and we continue today to be in 70%. So keep that in mind. Just as an information point, the content requirement was based on the date of delivery of the first production vehicle, not the date of the contract. But any new contracts now are going to have to require 70%. And finally, art and landscaping. In years past, prior to FAST, FTA routinely funded art in transit and landscaping. But now their rules have changed. And to get funding for these in a grant, they're going to have to demonstrate that they have a functional purpose. For example, landscaping might be necessary for erosion control or wind mitigation, something of that nature. It's going to have to be demonstrated in the application. Now, that's not a procurement responsibility, but just be aware of the new rules.
Now we want to take a look at where FTA needs your help. And we're going to do that by taking a look at some data. We have some data collected here from FY17 to FY21 related to triennial findings. And the chart reflects the number of findings in each of the various categories that are reviewed during a triennial. They are in order of magnitude here. And we see that procurement is at the top. If we look over to the right, we can see that procurement has a very large chunk of the pie. And why is that? Well, we were wondering and took a look at what were the top areas that kept coming up the most during triennials for deficient findings. And we see that it involved procurement policies and procedures where your procedures are out of date. You don't include all of the federal requirements. It's been a while since they were reviewed. Not doing independent cost estimates, not doing cost or price analysis, not including all of the required clauses in your procurements, not ensuring award to responsible contractors, and various certifications. We wanted to also compare that with procurement system reviews just to see what areas were coming up during that review, and turns out it's pretty much the same areas with the addition of written record of procurement history, which I'll note now that your procurement history starts at the very beginning of your procurement. When you first receive your requisition, that's now you're starting to build your procurement history, and everything involved in that procurement now needs to go in that file to tell the story of that procurement. So how do you avoid these areas of deficiency? It's very simple with the use of a checklist. The circular and the best practices procurement manual both speak to the use of a checklist. So it is important, and it can help you avoid missing those areas that were highlighted previously. Here's a sample of a checklist. We think this is a good sample in that it provides space for you to date when each action was taken and give the initials of the individual completing it. This is not an all-inclusive checklist. It's meant to be a document where you can modify as needed to suit your needs. Again, on your policies and procedures, please be sure that your personnel are trained and aware of the policies and procedures, and during interval, conduct self-assessments to ensure that staff are in compliance and that your files are in compliance. There are technically, well, actually 63 elements from the 2020 Procurement System Review Contractors Manual that must be addressed in your procedures, or they are deemed deficient. Okay, we have a link here to the guide for you to check the various elements. Here they are. These are those 63, 64 elements. You'll note that there are 79 on this list because we've added some over the years, some different areas or elements that have come up deficient. And although they were not part of the original 63, they are out of the circular and therefore eligible. And if you're not sure how important, or if you're not sure that you can garner a deficiency in this area, during the last triennial season, I had a reviewer contact me to ask if they should make a finding based on the fact that time and materials was not adequately addressed in those procedures. So it is a real thing, and you need to be aware of that.
Okay, now we're going to move into a large area called cost and price analysis. The reference at the top of the chart, 2 CFR Part 200, 324 deals with cost and price analysis. And we've taken the words from that section, the first words, put it on this chart. So let's look at it. The non-federal entity, that's you, the recipient, must perform a cost or price analysis in connection with every procurement action in excess of the simplified acquisition threshold. So let's stop there. The current simplified acquisition threshold that's been established by the federal government for you is now $250,000, a very large number. It's probably inappropriate for transit. It was put into a Defense Appropriation Act and applied to all agencies. Prior to that, we were dealing with something around 100,000, which would be more realistic. But as far as the feds are concerned, will only review cost or price analysis for contracts above 250,000. We would hope that you would choose a lower number, because it's really essential that you do some form of analysis for lower value contracts. So let's move on. It says the method degree is dependent upon the facts, but the starting point is to make an independent cost estimate. And I want to emphasize this is a starting point. This is not the whole requirement. So let's look at what does it mean to do an independent cost estimate? Well, the ICE, as we call it, is a should cost estimate of the current market prices. So the government wants you to know what this product should cost based upon what the market is currently paying for it. Why is this so important? Well, we like to use the example of a situation that happened in Richmond, Virginia some years ago, where a storm went through the city and caused major damages to many roofs, including transit agency. So the agency did a very detailed independent cost estimate to replace the roof, and they went on the street with an invitation for bids. Well, the bids came in 100% above the ICE, and the agency couldn't figure out how that could happen. So they called the vendors and they asked why the bids were so high. And the answers were all the same. Well, everyone was busy, and their regular personnel, their employees doing roof repair and replacement were all committed. And to do the transit agency job, they would have to hire new untrained crews. It's going to be very expensive. So with this information, the transit agency canceled the bid, went on the street about 8 months later, and the bids came in exactly where they should have been in the beginning. And the message of all this is simple, and you get it. You need to know what the item should cost, because if you rely solely on the bids, it may be a mistake. Something could be going on. Maybe it's an ambiguity in the specs. They're not understanding the job. So make sure you do this good independent estimate. So let's take a further look at, for commercial items, the best approach by far is to find out from previous competitive contract awards what the prices were for that product. You can do this quite simply by calling other agencies if you do not have a historical purchase. Make sure that you document your independent estimate, telling the reader what agency made the award, the date of award's important, the price, and the vendor. Quantities could be important. If they vary dramatically from what you're buying, it could affect the price. But I want to stress that this document is really being generated for the benefit of that individual in the agency who's got to make a determination of fair and reasonable price. And that's going to be the procurement office. So this document is really being generated for the benefit of the procurement office to tell them what the items should cost. And the procurement people need to know this information. You can't rely on something that you don't completely understand. So this is important. For professional services, we're not going to have a single price number because these contracts are going to be negotiated with the contractor on the basis of a cost proposal to do the work. It's going to have labor, overhead, profit, materials, travel. And the point is that the estimator needs to prepare this document in the same level of detail that the agency is going to request cost proposals be submitted. So the same breakdown of the major tasks and then the labor categories under each task with the hours and rates, etc. Because we need this ICE as a tool to evaluate the incoming cost proposals. And finally, final thing, as I already mentioned, the ICE is the first step. It does not satisfy the cost or price analysis requirements by itself. So you might want to consider using a sample ICE form. It's really an instruction to your technical people on what is expected of them in the ICE. Notice that we are saying documentation, tell us the previous contract awards, etc., that you're using. And for professional services, there should be some narrative explaining where the labor rates and the overhead rates, how they were estimated. Notice it's signed and dated. Very important to have a date on this document that predates the receipt of bids and proposals. If it lacks a date, FTA does not give you credit for it. If it's dated after the proposals come in, you don't get credit for it either. Okay, so now we'll come back to cost and price analysis in later slides, but we want to focus on contract types. There are three basic contract types that are available to you. One, first being the firm fixed price contract. This is what you're going to use with the vast majority of your procurements. You agree to pay a fixed price for a product that meets the specification in the contract. And under this contract, the contractor bears 100% of the risk for any overruns. Conversely, if he underruns the contract, he gets to keep that money too. It turns out to be profit. So then we want to look at cost plus fixed fee contracts. I know that there's many agencies that are not familiar with this or haven't used it. It's a contract where the costs are reimbursed, allowable costs are reimbursed as the contractor works on the contract. He bills monthly for costs incurred. And the fee is something that I want to stress here. The fee is the profit. The profit's going to be stated in dollar terms, not as a percent of cost, which would be illegal, but in dollar terms. And the point about the fee is so important. It has to be earned for completion of the contract. The fee is not earned merely by spending the money or working on the contract. He can bill it, of course, monthly, but it's a provisional billing. And the final analysis, if the contractor fails to completely perform the contract, the fee gets reduced based upon the percent of actual completion. So that if he underruns the contract and doesn't spend all the cost dollars, he still gets to keep the fee because it's tied to actual physical completion. Now let's compare that to time and material. Under this contract, you would negotiate a billing rate for each labor category that's fixed, has labor, overhead, and profit, and the contractor will then be billing profit for every hour worked is going to be profitable, and there's no responsibility to complete anything in order to get paid. He's simply paid for working on the contract. So the agency bears the total risk of overruns, not the contractor. Many contractors love this form of contract because it gives them no risk and a lot of profit. And so FTA actually restricts the use of time and material contracts. And you have to document your file if you're going to use this form that no other type of contract is suitable. So how do we think through that process? First off, we're going to look at the scope of work and the specifications. If they're clearly defined, then we are in the realm of fixed price contracts. That contractors see this, they understand it, they can quote a fixed price for doing the work. But what happens where the cost of performing the work is uncertain? Maybe the scope of work is pretty broad, and a contractor could not price it with a fixed price. It's too broad and the work is too uncertain. This is going to rule out the fixed price contract, and it creates secondary choices of CPFF versus time and material. Remember, time and materials are restricted. So the rules are really pointing us toward cost plus fixed fee contracts. Normally, if the contract size is sufficient, we would go that way. What do I mean by that? Well, remember, if we award a cost plus contract, we're going to have to audit it when the contract is complete. The cost of that audit is going to run at least $20,000 to get a CPA firm to audit the contract cost. So if the contract value is small, let's say it's 75 or 80,000, it makes no sense to award a CPFF contract where it's going to cost me 20,000 to audit it. So contract value becomes an important factor in my decision. If that contract value is certainly less than 100,000, I would rule out the CPFF contract just based on that fact, and that would leave me with time and material contract. Another thing that could rule out a CPFF contract is the contractor's accounting system may not be adequate for this form of contract. You must make certain that there is an accounting system that has been audited by a CPA and it is acceptable for identifying allowable costs on CPFF contracts. I can't tell you, there have been many tragic stories of small firms performing cost plus contracts, and when the time came for audit, the records were not there. And then it creates a tremendous legal issue. Okay, methods of procurement, just briefly. Micro purchases are those procurements of, in the federal realm, $10,000 or less. That's the new micro purchase threshold. You need not compete these, and they have no contract clauses. You may choose a lesser amount than $10,000. It used to be $3,500 before it was increased. many recipients still have numbers like that, above which they get competition. That choice is yours. Then we move on to sealed bid and RFPs. So these are being used now for procurements above the micro purchase threshold. Sealed bid is a process where we request bids based upon very definitive specs, and the bids are submitted and they are open publicly at a stated place and time. Award is made to the low bidder. No other factors are really evaluated to win that contract other than contractor responsibility. We use this when we do not need to have discussions with the contractor. But what if the statement of work is such that we really would like to have discussions because maybe there's different ways to meet the objective? And there are things other than price that are very important to us, technically important. Then we are in the RFP mode. So procurement people, this is an important decision to make. Two-step procedures, these are discussed in the FTA Best Practices Procurement Manual. And I would recommend that you read that. It has an excellent discussion of sealed bids and RFP proposal evaluation. The two-step procedure, sometimes we could use a technical solicitation to request technical proposals or qualifications. And we would then choose the companies that are capable of performing, and from them, as a second step, we would get fixed price proposals. So it's a way to narrow down the field so we don't have to evaluate a great many proposals that we know can't do the work. Architect and engineering are a special procurement group where the Federal Brooks Act requires us to use qualifications-based selection. We cannot use price as a factor. So once we've ranked the companies, then from the highest ranked firm, we request a cost proposal. We negotiate with them. If we fail to reach an agreement, we terminate them from further consideration, move on to number 2. Okay, construction. There are 2 basic approaches. The traditional method has been design, bid, build, where we select an architect as step 1 using qualifications to design the facility, give us the bidding documents, and put them on the street to select the contractor to construct the facility. So we have 2 contracts there, but there's another one approach that's come along in recent years called design build, where we have 1 solicitation. We select 1 contractor team of the constructor and the designer using the traditional procurement competition requirements with prices, and we select the team who's going to do both the design and build of the facility for a fixed price. Best value. Best value is a procurement approach used with the RFP methodology, where we tell the people, the vendors in the solicitation, that we are going to make a best value selection, which means that we're going to do a trade-off between technical merits and prices. And we're not going to determine the award by scoring, which is typical. The highest score wins. But we're going to look at the real strengths and weaknesses, what's being offered technically, and we're going to choose the best combination of technical value and price. And so that gives us maximum flexibility in making this contract award. So what about other than full and open competition? We have sole source, where there's only 1 source that can really do the work. A lot of times this happens with, say, modifying software, where we don't have the source code, so we can't put the system out for rebid, we only need one particular element change to enhance the package. And so we go sole source to the original software provider. And that makes all the sense in the world to do that. Single bids, we put out a solicitation requesting bids from multiple sources. We only get one bid in response. What do? Well, FTA wants us to call the no bid people and find out why they chose not to bid. And if the reasons are given or relate to specifications or restrictive, then we have a non-competitive thing. We've got to justify this internally and get it approved. If the reasons they give us were really business related, like I'm not interested in doing this work at this time, even though we have products, then you can treat the single bid as competitive and make the award without having to do a sole source justification. Unsolicited proposals, can we act and award contracts for them just because they're unsolicited? The answer is no. FTA wants you to go through a thought process that goes something like this. Well, the vendor has identified a need within the agency. If we agree with that there's an unmet need in the agency, can we put this out on the street and ask the vendors to come in with proposals how they're going to meet the need? And that would be the ideal approach. And then the proposal we've gotten in would come in a competitive environment. We would choose the best solution to the problem. So it's only if we cannot separate the need from the solution, if it's impossible, that we can award the unsolicited proposal without competition. Time and material contracts. We mentioned to you that these are restricted. Now, we've got to document the file that no other form of contract is feasible. That's being fixed price or cost plus fixed fee. Keep that in mind. I would also mention to you that if there are materials involved, they are reimbursed at cost. There's no markup on these for profit. Because if you entered into an agreement, say we're going to reimburse the cost of materials plus a markup, say of 7%, we've now entered into an illegal cost plus a percent of cost contract, and that's not allowable. And we mentioned that in the final bullet. That we want to avoid these, of course. So the next slide will deal with federal clauses. All right, the FTA Master Agreement really contains all the federal clause requirements. It can be difficult to use that because the clauses are not all in one section of the agreement. The easiest approach is to use 2 and 3 on the chart. The Procurement Circular Appendix D has a clause matrix, and it tells you a title of the contract clause that's required for each type of procurement, like construction, rolling stock, etc. Does not give you the clause language. For the clause language, we need to go to the Best Practices Manual, Appendix A, which has all the clause instructions. And there, for each of the clauses in the matrix, you will get the clause language. This is what the matrix looks like. As I said, this is only a part of it. There are many other contract clauses, but it will tell you when it's required and when the threshold, dollar threshold, is significant. Like this notice to FTA and the DOT Inspector General, that's the third clause, comes into play at 25,000. So if a contract below that would not require that clause. If it says all, then all contracts require the clause. Another resource is the National Rural Transit Assistance Program that FTA has funded. If you go to that link, you will see a tab for procurement, which will take you to some contract clause resources. You may want to check that out, and it should be current. You might want to use that as a resource for clauses too. And the final thing we would say is you must evaluate each procurement for the specific requirements. Do not incorporate all clauses in all contracts. Completely inappropriate to put construction clauses in a rolling stock contract. If we don't want to do that, but some recipients have done it, thinking that they satisfy the requirements, but FTA frowns on that, and it's very bad contracting practice. So in addition to the clauses, we have a lobbying certification that comes into play at 100,000 or more, where the prime and sub have to give you a certification that says essentially that they have not solicited a member of Congress to get the contract. That's what it's all about. And so clause A14 in the BPPM that's in Appendix A will give you the language that you need. I think what we've done is reproduce the directions where you can find the language in 49 CFR Part 20. So that's your resource, is the best practices manual. Okay, Buy America is an extremely important and extremely sensitive requirement. It is so because it's the highest priority now economically is for the government to keep jobs in the United States. And so grantees have to abide by the Buy America law. And that means any contract above 150,000 that has iron, steel, manufactured goods, or rolling stock has to be subject to Buy America, where the vendor certifies that it will comply with the Buy America requirements. Now, we've also given you a link to the FTA Buy America page just for your information. You should go there and check that out. But if you're buying rolling stock, FDA really now requires a copy. Look at the second bullet. Must have in its possession a copy of the Altoona bus testing report before final acceptance of the first vehicle. So all buses, whether they were tested years ago or recently, maybe they're new model buses, you've got to go to the Altoona test site at the Penn State University and download a copy of the bus testing report for your contract file. Advertising. The rule in advertising is only required for procurements above the simplified acquisition threshold. That's 250,000. You can advertise on your website by putting a notice. That would be adequate, or you can put it in local newspapers, trade journals, etc. You can choose a smaller amount. You can choose to advertise everything above 50,000 if that's your choice. But from the federal perspective, above 250, it must be advertised. If it's below that amount, you only need to solicit proposals from an adequate number of qualified sources. So we then address this question: what is adequate competition? So in the procurement circular in the sealed bid section, they define it as 2 or more responsible bidders. And that word's responsive important. Responsive mean they took no exception to any material item in the specification, in the solicitation. If you get 2 bids and one was non-responsive, you do not have adequate competition. You have to be 2 more responsive. And for proposals, the idea or the words used in the circular are adequate number of qualified sources. What's adequate? Well, we would say at least 2. At least 2. More would be better. More would be more competition, but at least 2. So let's then go back to our cost and price analysis topic. Price analysis is a process of looking at one total price. We're not concerned with individual cost elements that make up the price or the profit. We're going to use this for commercial items. This is how we spend our money. We just want to be sure that we're paying a fair market price. Cost analysis is something much different. It's going to be used when we cannot use price analysis. That's where we have to look at each cost element that makes up the total price. We have to get a detailed cost proposal from the contractor, looking at labor hours, labor rates, overhead rates, material prices, etc. And each element has to be evaluated and negotiated with respect to its reasonableness. And keep in mind, again, we must perform cost or price for all procurements above $250,000. And finally, on the page, FDA has published, and it's been there for a long time, a pricing guide for FDA recipients. At that link, it's worthwhile. We're going to talk next slide about some of the methods that are discussed there for doing price analysis. So this comes from the FTA pricing guide, 6 methods of doing price analysis. Adequate price competition. In other words, you get multiple bids. Make sure, though, with anything that you do, that you compare it to the independent cost estimate. Okay, prices set by law. If you're buying electricity or water, the jurisdiction sets the prices. That is sufficient. If you're dealing with catalog pricing, make sure that you get information that these represent substantial sales to the general public and they're not merely offers to sell. Comparison to previous purchases is an ideal methodology, especially for the ICE. Make sure they're competitive, though. Non-competitive sales don't count. Comparison to a valid recipient independent cost estimate. Yes, but it has to be prepared using market pricing information. And value analysis, if there is no direct product like the one you're buying, maybe things that perform similar functions, you can do a value analysis by comparing the performance differences with the price differences, and you make a judgment that you can pay a higher price because you're getting such a better performance differential. For cost analysis, we're going to get a detailed cost proposal, and it's going to have all these cost elements. And the technical officer and the procurement person play vital roles in this. Tech officer has got to look at labor categories and hours, at materials and travel, and give the procurement officer a memorandum of evaluating these costs. The procurement person is going to be primarily responsible for getting documentation to support the labor rates and the overhead rate in the proposal. This may have to come from an auditor, and it may come directly from the contractor through payroll printouts, but some kind of documentation to verify these costs has got to be done. And finally, the procurement person is going to concentrate also on the profit. It's important to know what the industry practice is, and from that, we're going to make adjustments up or down. Upward maybe for greater risk, and down for maybe greater subcontracting than normal. We would expect to pay a lower profit. Okay, debarment and suspension. Discussed in the best practice manual, clause A13. It applies to all contracts and subs of 25,000 or more, and you have 3 options available to you to determine whether or not this contractor is debarred or suspended. Number 1, you can go to sam.gov, put in the name, and keep that printout for your contract files to prove you've done this. So if he's not on that list, then he is qualified for contract award. 2 other ways is 1, to get a certification from the contractor And third is to add a clause to the contract or subcontract. And if you're going to do the certification or the clauses, you need the proper language. And that's, again, coming from the BPPM. Clause A13 will give you the language you need. You can do any one of these three approaches is acceptable. So that brings us to a responsibility determination. FTA expects you to make a responsibility determination for all contracts above the micro purchase threshold, I believe, and that means debarment or suspension should be checked. Past performance should be evaluated and documented. You may have to call the clients of the contractor, document the results. Financial condition, tech resources, ability to perform. Now, normally this would come about through, I think, looking at past performance. But for a large contract, new contract, you may want to do a review of Dun and Bradstreet report or get financial statements from the vendor and have them evaluated. If it's construction and the contractor is furnishing a performance bond from a surety, that is more than adequate proof that the contractor has the resources to perform, because bonding companies will not issue bonds until they've done a very thorough check of the financial condition and tech resources. And finally, document the determination and make sure it's one of the items on your contract file checklist. This is a sample documentation form, responsibility determination form that your buyer can fill out. It's very convenient, and put it in the contract file. Joint procurements, we want to talk a bit about joint procurements, rolling stock, etc. of, piggybacking and state contracts, to make sure we understand the rules. Now, for joint procurements, these are two or more agencies go out with a single solicitation, single contract, and all the federal rules apply, just as if there was only one. And so the contract clauses, certs, min-max quantities. If it's an IDIQ contract, must have max quantities, can't be open-ended. Okay, so but the next approach would be piggybacking. Don't confuse this with using a state procurement contract, because that's not piggybacking. Piggybacking is the assignment of existing contract rights to purchase supplies or equipment. So typically one transit agency goes out, let's say for rolling stock, and the contract has option provisions because the agency thought they would need at some time the option quantities. Well, they find out they don't need it, and they become available to other transit agencies. But they're only available if you meet three specific criteria. First, assignability clause in the original contract, which says that the agency has the right to assign deliverable items to other agencies at the same prices and terms and conditions. If you don't have that clause in the original contract, it cannot be piggybacked by FTA policy. Secondly, the contract must have min-max quantities. It can't be open-ended. And third, the original contract has to be compliant with the federal clauses, including Buy America. You cannot add the clause later. So the deal is that you have to get a copy of this contract and review it for these items. And if it's missing any one item, you're not going to be able to piggyback it. Okay, the fourth bullet says that since we're going to be exercising options, you're going to have to make a determination that the option prices are still the best obtainable on the market at the time. You could do this by doing some simple survey with some phone calls. If it's a rolling stock contract you're piggybacking, make sure that you get copies of all of the Buy America pre-award audits that were done and the certifications from the awarding agency. You need this for your file. But understand, you can rely on the audit work that was done, but you're the buyer of record and you have to sign your own pre-award certifications. There's 3 of them, and they're discussed in the module of Buy America. State purchasing schedules or contracts. As we said, now you can go to any state in the country. All the FTA requirements apply, but here's an important provision. If the state did not put in the federal clauses in its original competition, in its contract, you can still use that contract, but you have to now add the clauses in your first purchase order issued under the state contract. Remember, you could not do this with piggybacking, but you can do it with the state purchasing contract. Another important difference, no assignability clause is needed because everyone knows the state's buying for others. No min-max quantities are required by FTA. The one caveat that we would urge you to be aware of is make sure the state did not use a geographic preference. If they did, you could not use the state contract. Okay. FTA requires that recipients have a system in place to ensure that the contractors perform their contracts in accordance with the terms and conditions. So what does that look like? Well, it's very simple. Very simply, it would look like an assignment of contract administration responsibilities in writing to the personnel involved. The technical officer would get one. The procurement, the contracting officer would have assignment. People in the accounts payable, invoicing, they would know. But basically, the important thing here is that you tell the people in writing what their responsibilities are. And if you do that, then you will have complied with this contract administration system requirement.
Now we want to go back to written record of procurement history and stress the importance of ensuring that you have a complete procurement file with record of everything that occurred in relation to that procurement. Recipients are required to maintain and make these records available to FTA upon asking, detailing the history of each procurement. As we noted earlier, it is one of the most consistent findings during procurement system reviews. And it's just a simple matter of not having enough documentation to support what you did throughout the history of procurement. One way to ensure that you build a complete history procurement file is to utilize some type of checklist. But basically, this is just driving you to some type of standardization with regard to your procurement files. That way, all of them are set up the same way. Any reviewer or staff member can find what they're looking for in each procurement file in the same place. A well-documented file is going to speak for itself. It's going to stand alone. It's going to stand on its own 2 feet. Supports the actions that you were taking and provides information and furnishes essential facts about everything related to the procurement file. Okay. These are some minimum FTA requirements that are looked for during reviews. Rationale for the method of procurement, this should be documented. The reason for selection of the contract type, this should be documented. The reason for contractor selection, this should be documented. The documentation for each procurement is going to be commensurate to the size and complexity of that procurement. So you could very well end up with a file that contains samples of all of these different types of records. The main idea here is to put everything in relation to that file in the file so that you really don't need to have to ask any questions, or a reviewer would not have to ask questions about what happened. Now let's talk about periodically auditing your files. Periodically, you should be reviewing your files to make sure that they are complete. Utilizing some type of, again, file checklist. This checklist is different from the procurement checklist that you use throughout the procurement, ensuring that you don't miss federal requirements. This checklist is to make sure that everything is in the file. Okay. And so therefore, you're going to make sure that you're doing your responsibility determinations. If you modify the contract, you've explained the rationale behind that. Are you ensuring that you have a complete sound agreement, that the contract has a amount, a start and stop date, and the adequate provisions? Have you documented your cost and price analysis? And if you're doing sole source, ensure that you have a written justification. A sole source also generally will require a cost analysis for each sole source. Now we want to share some resources with you to help make doing your federal procurements a little easier. The first link is the FTA procurement landing page. From there, you pretty much can navigate to any of these other links pretty much, but we want to also give you those as well. In particular, the best practices procurement manual that you've heard discussed throughout this presentation, as well as the circular. These two are very close-knit and complement one another. And the second bullet here is a link to ACFR, A2CFR. There are many of them out there on the web. So find the one that you like the best and bookmark it. One of the best resources we can share with you is the third-party procurement frequently asked questions. This is a collection of questions that FTA has collected over the years and posted for your for you to take advantage of if you have a question. If you do have a question, this is probably the best place to start with your question. Okay. Some other resources are a Buy America handbook. If you're responsible for pre-award and post-delivery audits and certifications, you want to make sure you know how to find this handbook. It is very helpful, very resourceful. The second bullet is a link to the Joint Procurement Clearinghouse that was mentioned earlier. And the last bullet is a way for you to submit a question to headquarters. Of course, if you have a regional contract administrator, that's going to be your best and quickest resource to get your question answered. Here's a link that'll take you to the pricing guide that was mentioned, and also to a more expanded procurement self-assessment guide. And with that, we want to thank you for your attention and hope that you will take advantage of the other modules that are available. Please be sure to reach out to your local regional office to access versions of those modules.